right, thank you for the songs this morning. We'll be going to Leviticus chapter 3. We are continuing our series through Leviticus. This is now message number 4, entitled Peace with God. And we're going to be looking at Leviticus chapter 3. So we'll start with verses 1 and 2. And if his oblation be a sacrifice of peace offering, if he offer it of the herd, whether it be a male or female, he shall offer it without blemish before the Lord. And he shall lay his hand upon the head of his offering and kill it at the door of the tabernacle of the congregation. And Aaron's sons, the priests, shall sprinkle the blood upon the altar round about. So the three most common offerings in the Old Covenant were the burnt offering, the grain offering, and the peace offering. These were just the most common and ordinary offerings that were offered. There were some other special offerings and sacrifice things that we will see later in Leviticus. But these three are covered at the beginning of Leviticus. Chapter 1 covered the laws of the burnt offering. Chapter 2 covered the laws of the grain offerings. And the grain offerings had some familiar procedural aspects, but they differed in the elements, and they certainly differed in purpose from the burnt offering. Now, the main differences between them were that there was no animal in the offering of the grain offerings, and that only a token portion of that offering was burnt, and the rest of it was eaten by the priest. The grain offering was really what we might call an agricultural offering. It was an offering of the produce of the land. And while the meat of the burnt offerings and the meat of other animal sacrifices was more rare as a meal, the grain of the wheat offerings with the oil were a part of the daily staples of life for those of Israel. And so we are getting a highlighting of the daily commitment to God and to his service, even in those mundane tasks of life. Because once again, when you think about everything that it took to get that offering to the tabernacle, there was a lot of time, there was a lot of effort, there was a lot of work that went into getting all these things, growing them, harvesting, and preparing, and all of the things that were involved. And again, that's just the normal mundane course of life. Now, the portion of the grain offering that was to be burnt with the frankincense, which was an expensive aromatic resin that was primarily used in incense for burning. And this, once again, brings us back to thinking about some of the economics of the tabernacle and of the priestly service. Because on the one hand, it seems that maintaining the services of the tabernacle and maintaining the priests for that service was very expensive for the nation of Israel. But then on the other hand, it was to come from the produce that God gave them, which would be very abundant as they obeyed him and they kept the covenant. And of course, the only way that it would be viewed as being expensive or being taxing was if any Israelite viewed their property as their own possession and of their own making. In other words, the only way that they would really look upon these requirements and think, well, this is just too much. This is asking too much. This is costing too much. The way that would happen would be if they lost sight of how did they get those things that they had? How did they get what they had to offer? And so if they lost sight of that, then they might begin to think that it was a great burden in that way. Now, all of this, once again, reinforces the seriousness of God's presence, and the only way of approaching God is through his prescribed means. And that, of course, is something that never changes. There were certain prescribed means during the Old Covenant time, but there's always his prescribed way of approach. Chapter 3 gives us the third of the three common offerings of the Old Covenant. And this third one is the peace offering. Now, the peace offering shares a number of similarities with the burnt offering, but there is an immediately obvious difference, and that is with these peace offerings, there was a festive meal that followed the sacrifice. Now, Leviticus doesn't actually focus a lot on this meal that was to take place. Later, it was commanded that it was to be eaten with joy. That's in Deuteronomy chapter 27. And we find that anyone, the offerer, of course, had to be, and anyone who was ceremonially clean could partake of this festive meal. So it would be the family and the friends of the one who brought it to offer, as well as the priests. And another primary difference is that the peace offering was a voluntary offering. So the burnt offering is prescribed at certain times. The grain offering is prescribed at certain times. And the peace offering was something that sometimes we refer to as a free will offering. It was a voluntary offering. And Leviticus 7, in fact, talks about this particular offering and mentions three different occasions. One of those would be the giving of thanksgiving. So verse number 12. So if there was, it could be some special event, maybe something that a journey that was going on, and it was an offering upon return of thanksgiving for safety in travel and that sort of thing. So an occasion of thanksgiving that this was an offering that could be given. Another it mentioned is the payment of a vow. And so if some vow had been taken on and it had been fulfilled, and then one of the offering that would be given would be a peace offering. And then, of course, it mentions it as a completely free will offering that could be given at any time and really for much any reason. Now, the point of the peace offering, the point was fellowship and communion. And so peace between God and the offerer. That was primarily the point of this offering. And the structure of this chapter divides the instruction into three different parts according to the animal being offered. Because just like the other offerings, there's variation in this offering, in what could be offered. And again, it's presented in a descending value. Now, one big difference from the burnt offering is that there's no birds that are specified for this offering. And there's no explanation for why there's no birds in this particular offering. Although I tend to agree with what seems to be a pretty common opinion that the bird, a turtle dove or a pigeon, just simply wouldn't provide a meal to be observed from the remnants of this sacrifice, and so that seems a good practical reason. But otherwise, we're not told. So we want to look at this in these three parts. So in verses 1 to 5. We get the prescription for an offering from the herd. In verses 6 to 11, an offering from the sheep. And in verses 12 to 17, an offering from the goats. So we'll start with the offering from the herd here in verses 1 to 5. And if his oblation be a sacrifice of peace offering, if he offer it of the herd, whether it be a male or female, he shall offer it without blemish before the Lord. And he shall lay his hand upon the head of his offering and kill it at the door of the tabernacle of the congregation. And Aaron's sons, the priests, shall sprinkle the blood upon the altar round about. And he shall offer of the sacrifice of the peace offering an offering made by fire unto the Lord, the fat that covereth the inwards, and all the fat that is upon the inwards, and the two kidneys, and the fat that is on them, which is by the flanks, and the caul above the liver, which with the kidneys, it shall he take away. And Aaron's sons shall burn it on the altar upon the burnt sacrifice, which is upon the wood that is on the fire. It is an offering made by fire of a sweet savor unto the Lord. Now, again, the word for oblation that's used, we've encountered it before, is the word korban, actually. And it just means a sacrificial present. It just means something that's offered. It can have the connotation of something being offered at an altar. sort of thing, but it's not it's sort of a general term. Now, the word for sacrifice, that's oblation, be a sacrifice of peace offering. Now, this word for sacrifice here is different, and it really presents a different category of sacrifices from burnt offerings or purification sacrifices. And sometimes this word is used to categorize peace offerings as communal sacrifices because there is an associated meal, a festive meal that is associated with the presenting of this sacrifice. And this word itself indicates a slaughter sacrifice. It is a blood sacrifice. In other words, it is more specific. And the first time that this word appears actually in Genesis is late in Genesis with Jacob in chapter number 31. And it appears here the first time in Leviticus, and then it appears many times after this. But just once again, as an aside, this term is never anywhere associated with Cain and Abel's offerings in Genesis chapter number 4. That is the general term, the mina, that is used there. Now, peace offering, it seems a little difficult in translation. And some of the newer translations it seem like they all have a little bit different take on it. Some call it a well-being offering, a fellowship offering, a peace offering. If we were trying to be a little more literal with the word, I understand it would be something like a requital offering. But really, it communicates the ideas of wholeness and of wellness. So it really is more of the Hebraic concept of peace than really what our modern concept of peace. We generally think about peace as just a cessation of hostilities. Usually it's a negotiation, and then there's compromise, and there's concessions that are given, and all of those sort of things. And that is not the kind of peace that is being spoken of here when we're talking about peace with God. That is a completely different sort of peace. So it's not just the ending of bloodshed, but it's actually the peace that requires bloodshed. And it emphasizes, once again, the requirements of the holy God on sinful people. And it just emphasizes this fact: you will not be at peace with God without the shedding of blood. You will not be at peace with Him. Now, chapter 7 gives further details about this sacrifice, so we're not getting into all those things in chapter 7. We'll get there before too long. So this offering, we read that it could be from the herds, it could be from the cattle, and it could be either male or female. And of course, that's a difference from the burnt offering as well. But it was still, whether it was male or female, the offering was still required to be without blemish, an unblemished animal. The best of the herd and the defective animals were not permitted to be offered in sacrifice. Now, this idea has certainly been greatly distorted over time, but it does highlight again what we're seeing as a recurring principle of giving to God what is first and what is best. Again, there's a lot of modern distortion to that we're not going to take time to get into. But this is also similar to the burnt offering. The offerer brought the animal, the offerer leaned on its head, pressed on its head, and then killed it at the entrance of the tabernacle. Now, in some cases, the pressing of the head of the animal to be offered is an explicit confession of sin. And what is an imputation? That it's a transfer. It is a symbolic act where the offerer would place the hand, press the head of the animal, thereby suggesting transfer of sins from the offerer to the animal, and then the animal would be slaughtered and offered as a substitute. Now, there are places where that is made explicit as to what is going on, what the symbology, what the meaning of this is. But just more generally, the pressing of the head of the animal was for identification and was for designation, because still the animal, the sacrifice, it's still substitutionary. Because even though you might be able to offer a pristine animal without any defect and without any blemish, that offerer was never without defect and without blemish. And so there is still the concept of identification, and that is really what is primary here. It's still a substitutionary sacrifice. There's still an identification between the offerer and the animal. And part of that animal was to be burned on the fire. It was not a whole burnt offering, but part of it was to be burned on the fire. Specifically, we're told the fat, the kidneys, and the liver, or I think the word there, the caul of the liver, referring to the appendage or lobe of the liver that was to be offered on the altar. Now, the fat here that is mentioned, this is not every trace of fat throughout the meat of this animal, but it refers specifically to the fat that would be that is just underneath the skin, oftentimes having to be scraped. It is the fat under the skin, and it's also that sort of would be upon the organs. It would just sort of be peeled from the organs. And this fat was given entirely to Yahweh. And this burnt offering is likewise noted as resulting in a pleasing aroma to God. Now, of course, it would be the meat of the animal. Some of it specifically was designated for the priest, and other parts of it would be eaten in this festive feast. But again, Leviticus here doesn't put a lot of emphasis on the actual meal. Now we get to the next part here, beginning with verse 6, and this is an offering from the sheep. So this is verses 6 to 11. And if his offering for a sacrifice of peace offering unto the Lord be of the flock, male or female, he shall offer it without blemish. If he offer a lamb for his offering, then shall he offer it before the Lord, and he shall lay his hand upon the head of his offering and kill it before the tabernacle of the congregation. And Aaron's son shall sprinkle the blood thereof round about the altar. And he shall offer the sacrifice of the peace offering, an offering made by fire unto the Lord, the fat thereof and the whole rump. It shall he take off hard by the backbone, and the fat that covereth the inwards, and all the fat that is upon the inwards, and the two kidneys, and the fat that is upon them, which is by the flanks, and the caul above the liver with the kidneys, it shall he take away. And the priest shall burn it upon the altar. It is the food of the offering made by fire unto the Lord. So the next two animal types actually come from the flock, and they actually share a lot in common in terms of just the procedure of the offering of this animal. The main difference between the two is going to be the animal itself and differences that are inherent in the physiology of these animals. So a sheep from the flock, we're told once again, it could be male or female. It doesn't matter, but it still must be an unblemished animal. And the process for the sacrifice is still going to be the same. Now, the primary difference is what we get here that is in reference in verse number 9. In our translation, it says the whole rump. Some of the newer translations say the fat tail, which what is being referred to here is a particular breed of sheep that would have been common in that part of the world and could be referred to as something like a fat tail sheep or a broad tail sheep. And these particular sheep did have a difference in the fact that they actually stored fat in their tail and in their hindquarters, much in a similar way that a camel does in its hump. And the tail would actually grow as the fat reserve is building up. I read some accounts of some of those coming to weigh as much as 15 pounds, just the tail on this animal. Now, the code here requires not merely the trimming of the fat from the tail, but actually its removal. The entire tail was cut close to the backbone and was to be offered and burned on the altar. And so this explains the difference that we see as we just read through this quickly, and we see a difference in procedure between the cattle, the sheep, and the goats. And well, these particular sheep were the only ones that had this particular fat reserve that is given specific instruction that it is to be removed entirely and to be burnt on the altar. Now, the fat, I also understand that the fat that is stored in the tail is somewhat different from the regular fat of the animal. And there are different words that are used in the Hebrew here to speak of the two different fats that were to be removed. Now, I also understand that the fat of this tail was particularly valuable for cooking. Whatever it all is made up of. And we shouldn't think of this when you read that. We should not think of this as a removal of some undesirable part of the animal. Let's just cut that off and get rid of it anyway. Nor is it a worthless part of the animal. It's actually a very valuable part of this particular breed of sheep in that part of the world, and was highly used, highly sought after. Now, the food of the offering that we read about here presents this as a participation. So the Lord's portion, so it's presented sort of like that communal meal, and the Lord's portion is burnt, it's consumed upon the altar. The priest's portion is given, and the offerer's portion was eaten as well. So the peace offering was what we might think of as a sacrificial meal. Now, the last part here of the offering from the flock would be that of the goats that begins in verse 12. Let's look at verses 12 to 15. And if his offering be of a goat, then he shall offer it before the Lord, and he shall lay his hand upon the head of it, and kill it before the tabernacle of the congregation. And the sons of Aaron shall sprinkle the blood thereof upon the altar round about. And he shall offer thereof his offering, even an offering made by fire unto the Lord, the fat that covereth the inwards, and all the fat that is upon the inwards, and the two kidneys, and the fat that's upon them, which is by the flanks, and the caul above the liver with the kidneys, it shall he take away. So the other acceptable offering from the flock would be from the goats. And it's essentially a repetition of the procedure from before. Obviously, there's a difference, and there's no fat tail or broad tail goat, so that would be a difference in the procedure between that and the sheep. So there's a notable absence of that. Otherwise, it is much the same. But once again, we're seeing a descending sort of value. So in terms of value, in terms of the cost or the worth of a particular animal, you would be at the highest level in the beginning with the cattle. You would be sort of in the middle there with this particular breed of sheep that is being referred to. And then you'd be on the bottom with the reference to the goats. So we're getting that same structure as what we have seen before. And then when we get to verses 6 to 17, we're getting this sort of concluding instruction. It says, "And the priest shall burn them upon the altar. It is the food of the offering made by fire for a sweet savor. All the fat is the Lord's. It shall be a perpetual statute for your generations throughout all your dwellings, that ye eat neither fat nor blood." So it's noted once again that the result of this burnt offering, it is the same. It's a pleasing aroma to Yahweh. And so when you look at this chapter, the first offering that's mentioned results in a pleasing aroma, and then the last offering has the mention of the pleasing aroma, which sort of encircles and closes all of it together. But there's a declaration here that all of this fat that has been described as being burnt upon the altar, all of this fat belongs to Yahweh. It wasn't the offerer, nor was it the priest, nor was it any combination of the two who decides who gets what. So it is a communal offering in the sense that there are participants, so to speak, and all participants are getting a portion of this offering. But how that offering is divided is not left to chance. It's not left to question. It's not left to decision by committee. It is by God's fiat, by His word, His declaration. And so He says here that the fat is the Lord's. So even though it's a fellowship sacrifice and meal, the fellowship is still strictly on God's terms. And of course, that is something that never changes. Something that even John referred to when we're studying the letter of 1 John, that there can be many who say that they have fellowship with God, but if these things are true or not true, whatever the case may be, then they're lying. They don't have fellowship with God. They don't know Him. Fellowship with God is ever and always strictly on His terms. It's not left up to what might appeal to us, what we might think that God likes. I think Steve was mentioning something about that in Sunday school about someone having problems with thinking of God in these terms. Well, that's just not the God I know. The God I know wouldn't do that sort of thing. It's not left up to us, and it's not up to our determination. Never has been and never will be. And so we see this being just explicitly stated. All of the fat belongs to the Lord. It is His. He claims it of His own. And there's a portion for the priest, there's a portion for the offer. And again, that's brought out a little later in Leviticus. But we're told that this is for a perpetual statute. This is an enduring statute under the Old Covenant. The sacrificial fat, and particularly you can just look right back to verses 14 and 15, which gives us this description of it, this sacrificial fat. Again, this is not a reference to every bit of fat that is all throughout and in the musculature of the animal and all that sort of thing. It's not that. It's very particular fat that is in this animal. And it is described here clearly enough to be distinguished in this passage. All of that fat that is described, God says, belongs to Him. And they of Israel are prohibited from eating it in their houses throughout their generations. So this is a prohibition that comes down not just for this sacrifice. This is a prohibition that comes down for their daily life. They were not to eat of this particular fat. Now, the fat tail, once again, that was talked about with the sheep, that is a different word. And so it is not included in this dietary restriction. So it doesn't come under that. Now, of course, in the actual peace offering, there was direction given just for that. So that was not to be eaten by the priest or the offerer in that particular instance, but otherwise was not outlawed or prohibited. And we also have the prohibition against the eating of blood. Now, there is more specific directions about that in chapter number 7. And it's explained later in Leviticus, chapter 17, in fact, that this prohibition against the eating of blood was because that life is in the blood, and that it's the blood that makes an atonement. That's all the explanation of it that we are given. So when we think about this particular offering, this offering speaks of peace and of fellowship with God. But we see all of this prescription. And again, the idea is not to come away saying, well, having peace with God used to require a whole lot, but it don't require anything now. Now we just have peace with God, I guess, if we just want it. No, that's not the case. Again, the gospel makes very clear that Jesus Christ was the Lamb slain from the foundation of the world. Peace with God requires infinitely more than what is prescribed in Leviticus. That's the problem the writer of Hebrews was picking up on, that this isn't enough. It falls short. It doesn't make it. The priesthood is not sufficient. The tabernacle is not sufficient. The altar is not sufficient. The animals are not sufficient. It is not sufficient. It's not enough. The cost is infinitely more than what we are reading about here in Leviticus. So we have to keep that in mind. But nevertheless, the broad principle is that peace and fellowship with God are provisions by His grace. They're not anything that we can create or that we can achieve through our effort. We also see that the proper worship of God is always on His terms and not ours. It's not what the worshiper thinks is appropriate or is proper or is fitting or is acceptable. It is what God has declared. We continue also to see these valuable commodities just going up in smoke, as it were, just burned on the altar. And again, it should reinforce to us that peace with God is costly. And you really get this burned into us. And we'll go to Romans and read it a little bit differently. Therefore, having been justified by faith, therefore we have peace with God. Apart from the law, apart from the works, apart from the sacrifices. Again, that is a profound statement because peace with God is costly. The message of the gospel does not diminish that. Once again, it heightens the fact that a peace with God is costly. It costs the infinitely valuable blood of God's only Son, Jesus Christ. And also, we're beginning to see here, and we'll see more of this as we continue on in Leviticus, and then later, by God's grace, we get to other parts of the Pentateuch as well. Fellowship with God is something that's not just about the mere escaping of wrath. Fellowship with God is something that should include thanksgiving and rejoicing. And again, in Deuteronomy, he tells them they are to eat this with joy, commands them to eat it with joy. The peace offering especially shows that Israel wasn't just merely delivered from Egypt. Now, some of them had that complaint against God. Well, yeah, you brought us out of Egypt, but you just brought us out here in the wilderness to die. You just brought us out here in the desert to die, just to starve to death, to die of thirst. His redemption of Israel, as that stated purpose is made very plain, even beginning with Sinai, his redemption of Israel was to live with them. It was to have fellowship with them, to be in their midst, for them to be his people, to be a holy nation, to be a kingdom of priests. Of course, we know that they failed. But that fellowship required blood sacrifice, priestly mediation, and personal holiness. All of which, or none of which, I should say, they could ever achieve. Nor can we. Nor can we. All right, we will stop here and we will close with a hymn.